My name is Serena Langford, and I am 32 years old. I serve as an assistant district attorney in the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, a city of red brick facades and towering pines, where southern gentility brushes up against the relentless churn of modern life. To most observers, my upbringing reads like a fairy tale gone awry. I was born into the Langford dynasty, a family whose name once signified old money prestige, civic influence, and philanthropic largesse throughout the Tar Heel state. My grandmother founded the Langford Foundation, endowing universities and cultural institutions. My mother served as a state senator. My father presided over Langford and Company, a sprawling investment firm headquartered in downtown Raleigh. Yet beneath that veneer of power and privilege lay a world I never truly inhabited. My parents filled our Georgian manor with priceless antiques and hanging oil portraits, yet they never spoke of love. My mother, Evangeline Langford, maintained a flawless composure at gala fundraisers, her tailored suits immaculate and her smile practiced. At home, she was distant, her conversation as polished as the mahogany panels that lined our dining hall. My father, Harrison Langford, was a titan in finance, an imposing man with steel grey hair and eyes colder than the Carolina winter. He taught me to recite financial ratios at age 9 and to sit quietly through board meetings by age 12. From the earliest days of my childhood, I sensed that nothing I did would ever be enough. If I studied literature instead of economics, my father frowned. If I played the cello rather than tennis, my mother held her breath, as though I had committed some unforgivable betrayal. In private moments, I practiced my scales until my fingers bled, longing for a single nod of approval. Yet approval never came. I was the elder of 2 children, and as the heir apparent to the Langford legacy, I was expected to embrace the family business upon graduation from college. But I felt no kinship with high-stakes mergers or boardroom machinations. Instead, I found solace in courtroom dramas and crime novels, captivated by characters of moral conviction who pursued justice despite overwhelming odds. At 16, I volunteered at the Wake County Public Defender's Office, delivering sandwiches to overworked attorneys and organising case files. There, I glimpsed a world far removed from the gilded confines of my childhood home. A world where real people fought for their dignity, where every decision carried weighty consequences. I remember one warm September evening when I was 18 and newly arrived at Duke University. I attended a lecture by an esteemed judge renowned for his work defending the wrongly convicted. He spoke of battered mothers, abandoned veterans, and innocent men ensnared by a broken system. As I sat in that lecture hall, I felt something within me ignite, a fierce determination to devote my life to the defense of truth and the protection of the vulnerable. When I returned home that night, I confessed my ambitions to my parents. I told them I wanted to major in criminal justice and pursue a career as a public defender. My mother's lips thinned, my father's face darkened. "A Langford in the courts?" he said, his voice low. "Our family commands corporations and shapes policy. No Langford becomes a mere lawyer for criminals." My heart pounded as I realised that the gulf between their expectations and my own dreams would never close. That winter, I left a prepaid acceptance letter to Columbia Law School unopened on my desk, replacing it with an application to North Carolina Central University's School of Law, an institution known for its commitment to social justice. My parents discovered my deception when the scholarship committee congratulated me by mail. I still recall the afternoon my father found me in my childhood bedroom, the fine dust motes drifting through the slatted blinds. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, and simply said, "You are no Langford." It was the first time he spoke to me with contempt rather than calculation. I dropped out of the glass-domed conservatory where I practiced cello. I left the tennis team. I refused every summer internship at Langford Company. Instead, I interned at a legal aid clinic in downtown Durham, where I met clients whose faces bore the marks of hardship far more profound than anything I had ever known. I worked long nights drafting motions for restraining orders, visiting jails to meet with clients, and sitting amidst stacks of dusty case files. By the time I graduated from law school, penniless and estranged from my family, I had discovered my vocation. I accepted a clerkship with a federal judge whose courtroom was a world apart from my childhood boardrooms. Here, each plea bargain, each ruling, carried the weight of a person's liberty. I learned to wield the law not as a tool of profit, but as an instrument of mercy, and to stand unflinchingly for those who had no one else to stand for them. Now, as I navigate the intricate corridors of the district attorney's office, I carry both guilt and pride. Guilt for the life I abandoned, pride for the calling I embraced. My parents disowned me in a terse televised statement. No unusual punishment for anyone daring to stray from the Langford lineage, but I sleep soundly, knowing that every step I take in pursuit of justice honours a different legacy. The legacy of conscience over convenience, of compassion over commerce, of the true dignity inherent in every human soul. And so, this is where my story begins. At the intersection of privilege and principle, where the daughter of a dynasty chose a path of service, accepting the loneliness of moral conviction over the hollow comfort of inheritance. After graduation, I left behind the marble halls of privilege and moved into a modest apartment on the edge of Durham. Wisteria vines curled around the wrought iron railing outside my window, and each morning I stepped onto creaking floorboards instead of gleaming marble. Around me were bright posters advertising free legal clinics and pro bono services, not the portraits of Langford ancestors lining polished corridors. My wardrobe shifted from tailored suits to comfortable jeans and well-worn sneakers. My first position was as a legal intern at Justice and Hope Legal Clinic, a non-profit committed to serving clients who could not afford private counsel. From dawn until long after sunset, I sat amid stacks of case files, drafting petitions for release on recognizance, gathering records from underfunded social agencies, and visiting clients in criminal lockups. I drove my aging sedan through narrow back streets to meet mothers facing eviction and veterans struggling with mental health crises. Their faces bore the harsh imprint of systemic neglect, and yet in their eyes I detected a fragile glimmer of hope. Hope that someone at last would listen to their stories. One crisp October morning, I boarded the courthouse shuttle bound for Durham County Juvenile Detention Center, where youth offenders awaited hearings for offences ranging from petty theft to trespassing. On the radio, the morning news report blared about rising crime rates and strict enforcement measures designed to deter future offences. I pressed my forehead against the window, recalling the words of the judge whose lecture had once ignited my passion. Justice is not found in punishment alone, but in restoring dignity and opportunity. I resolved then to become an agent of that restoration, even if it meant working within a system I longed to transform. Within weeks, senior attorney Marcus Elliott recognised my zeal and invited me to represent a single mother, Amelia Torres, charged with shoplifting groceries for her young daughter. Amelia's eyes were red from sleepless nights. She clutched a faded photo of her child tightly in her trembling hand. I combed through her circumstances, skyrocketing food prices, stagnant wages, and the absence of accessible social services, and crafted a compassionate defense that underscored her motivations. At the hearing, I walked into the courtroom, a space that felt more like an austere amphitheatre than a seat of justice. The prosecuting attorneys in crisp navy suits glanced at me with polite condescension, but I met their gazes without flinching. My voice wavered only slightly as I addressed the bench. I described the cost of bread rising beyond reach, the outrage of a mother cornered by despair, and the potential for productive intervention rather than incarceration. I argued for community service coupled with social support referrals, rather than a criminal record that would haunt Amelia for years. As I spoke, the courtroom grew silent. I noted sympathetic nods from the bailiff and soft murmurs among spectators when the judge delivered a sentence of supervised community service and mandated assistance from a local food security nonprofit. Relief and triumph swelled within me. Amelia wept softly at the defense table, pressing her fingertips to her lips in gratitude. In that moment, I understood the true power of advocacy. A few months later, an unexpected opportunity arose. The Raleigh District Attorney's Office invited me to join as an assistant prosecutor. The offer shocked me. Shifting from ardent defender to enforcer of the state's will seemed at odds with my convictions. Yet the office's leadership emphasized their mission. Our goal is not convictions for their own sake, but equitable justice for every party. I recognized that working inside the prosecutor's office would let me influence charging decisions, plea, negotiations, and diversion programs at a systemic level. I accepted the challenge, knowing that this new role would demand a delicate balance between holding offenders accountable and safeguarding fairness. On my first day at the DA's office, I entered a stately downtown building, its marble foyer echoing with footsteps and hushed conversations. I met with Chief Deputy Linda Graham, a seasoned litigator whose silver hair framed a face weathered by decades of trials. She greeted me kindly, yet firmly. "We've heard of your work at Justice and Hope. Here, you'll face difficult choices. Sometimes you'll pursue charges, other times you'll advocate for leniency. Always ask yourself, does this serve true justice?" Her words reverberated in my mind as I donned the prosecutor's dark robe for my inaugural courtroom appearance. Across the aisle sat the defense attorney, a young public defender whose notebook overflowed with case details. Before me lay the state's case against a man accused of assault. As I reviewed witness statements and police reports, I weighed every piece of evidence against potential mitigating factors. His history of mental health struggles and lack of prior convictions. When I rose to present, I urged the court to consider a diversion program that paired therapeutic counselling with community service, rather than a harsh sentence that might only perpetuate a cycle of violence. That day, the judge approved the diversion plan. As I stepped down, I felt the familiar surge of purpose. I was no longer solely a defender of the underprivileged, nor merely an agent of enforcement. I had become something greater, a steward of justice in its fullest sense, capable of shaping outcomes that honoured both the rule of law and the humanity of those who stood before it. Thus began the next phase of my journey, navigating the intricate terrain between prosecution and compassion, ever mindful that true justice demands not only adherence to statutes, but unwavering empathy for every soul it touches. My third week in the district attorney's office, tested every conviction I had forged in those crowded clinic hallways. I was assigned my first solo prosecution, a shoplifting case involving Marcus Delgado, a 19-year-old college freshman accused of stealing electronics valued at over $1,000. His record was clean, but video evidence appeared damning. I pored over the footage and police reports late into the night, haunted by the question that had driven me since law school. When does punishment become cruelty? The morning of the preliminary hearing, I arrived early to review my notes with investigator Laura Chen. Laura was a veteran of the office, methodical, unflappable, with an encyclopedic knowledge of local statutes. "Serena," she said quietly as we sat side by side at a long metal table, "you're not here to win a popularity contest. But remember, every defendant is also someone's child." Her reminder stirred a knot in my stomach. I had to balance my duty to enforce the law with my belief in mercy. In court, Marcus sat alone at the defense table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. His mother had called to say she could not attend because she worked 2 shifts at the hospital. I felt a pang of sympathy. When my turn came, I stood and addressed the judge, summarizing the prosecution's position calmly and respectfully. I emphasized the value of the stolen items and the clear chain of custody on the evidence. Yet I also noted Marcus's lack of prior offences and the potential for rehabilitation. Detecting my hesitation, the defence attorney, an older man named Robert Fields, seized the opening. He painted a sympathetic portrait. Marcus, he said, was preparing for finals, under tremendous stress, and had panicked when he believed he would fail. He asked the court to consider deferred prosecution or community service instead of jail time. The judge listened intently, his lined face unreadable. After a brief recess, the judge returned with his ruling. Marcus would enter a deferred prosecution program, complete 200 hours of community service, and attend a counselling workshop on decision-making and stress management. He warned Marcus that any violation would trigger full prosecution. In that moment, I realised the power of nuance, that justice could encompass both accountability and growth. As I gathered my papers, Marcus stood slowly and offered me a hesitant nod. His eyes met mine for the first time, and I saw relief flicker there. Outside the courtroom, Laura fell into step beside me. "You did well," she said. "You brought the full weight of the law, then tempered it with reason." I exhaled, feeling a small victory settle in my chest. That afternoon, I drafted my impressions for the officer's case review. I recommended more robust diversion programs for first-time offenders and proposed coordination with local non-profits to expand support services. The memo required approval from senior prosecutors, but I stood by it, believing that systemic change began with a single suggestion. Walking home under the looming oaks and lantern-lit sidewalks of Durham, I pondered how far I had come from the marble halls of my parents' estate. I no longer measured success by wealth or prestige, but by the quiet transformations I witnessed, like Marcus's hesitant nod. This was the work I had chosen. A life defined by the steady pursuit of fair outcomes, by the constant negotiation between law and compassion, and by the unwavering belief that even in small victories, justice endures. Within my first month at the Raleigh District Attorney's Office, I encountered a case that would forever refine my understanding of justice's complexities. It began on a humid summer morning when dispatch alerted us to an assault in a downtown convenience store. The suspect was identified as Isaiah Reed, a 25-year-old veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. According to the clerk's report, Isaiah had shoved the cashier during an anxiety attack, nearly toppling her to the linoleum floor. No weapon was shown, but the clerk's trembling voice and tearful testimony painted a vivid portrait of fear. Assigned as lead prosecutor, I opened Isaiah's file and discovered his military record. 2 tours overseas, commendations for bravery, and a medical discharge due to severe combat trauma. After his return, he'd struggled to reintegrate, lost jobs, mounting bills, and the constant nightmare of battlefield memories. In a moment of panic, he had lashed out at a stranger. The law demanded accountability for assault, yet my conscience urged me to consider the man behind the incident. I arranged a meeting with Isaiah at the County Veterans Outreach Centre. The room smelled of coffee and antiseptic, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Isaiah sat hunched in a plastic chair, tattoos winding down his forearms like faded script. His gaze flicked between me and the door, wary but hopeful. I introduced myself not as prosecutor, but as someone seeking to understand. He spoke haltingly of sleepless nights, of the image of his fallen comrade flashing in his mind when the convenience store bell chimed. He described the cashier's startled face and the horror that swept through him afterward, the realization that he had hurt an innocent person. By the time he finished, tears traced dark lines along his dusty cheeks. That afternoon, I consulted with Chief Deputy Graham and the Victim Services Unit. The clerk, though shaken, expressed willingness to attend a restorative justice meeting rather than press for jail time. We arranged a mediated session. Isaiah would apologize in person, commit to behavioral therapy, and complete community service at the outreach centre. In exchange, the DA's office would recommend probation instead of incarceration. On the day of the restorative hearing, the clerk sat facing Isaiah in a small conference room. I observed quietly alongside a counsellor and a court reporter. Isaiah's voice trembled as he offered a sincere apology, recounting his combat trauma and pledging to seek help. The clerk listened, tears in her eyes, and nodded, her forgiveness a fragile bridge between them. The counsellor outlined Isaiah's treatment plan, and the clerk agreed to participate in follow-up sessions if needed. When the session ended, I rose to address both parties. "The law seeks fairness," I said, "but it also demands compassion. Today, justice did more than punish, it healed." Later, in my office, I drafted the plea agreement recommending probation with mandatory therapy, citing the restorative outcome. Walking back to my desk, I felt the weight of what we had achieved. A veteran's dignity preserved, a victim's voice honoured, and the legal system stretched toward empathy. In that moment, I understood that true justice is not blind. It sees each person's story, acknowledges harm, and fosters reconciliation. And as I prepared my next case file, I carried that lesson forward, determined to ensure that every decision balanced the scales not only of law, but of humanity. The autumn leaves had just begun to turn when my next assignment came across my desk. A cluster of misdemeanor domestic disturbance calls in the northeastern neighborhood of Raleigh. 3 separate incidents, all involving partners in relationships marred by financial stress and miscommunication, had erupted into shouting matches and minor injuries. The victims, 2 women and 1 man, had each been admitted to the emergency room, bruised and frightened, but none pressed charges beyond seeking medical attention. As the newly appointed liaison to the office's Domestic Violence Intervention Unit, I was tasked with coordinating our response across law enforcement, social services, and community nonprofits. I started by convening a meeting at the DA's office conference room. The table stretched long and dark beneath a row of fluorescent lights. Stacks of case files formed small towers in front of each seat. Present were Detective Alicia Ramirez from the Raleigh Police Department, Social Worker Supervisor Nina Patel from Wake County Family Services, and the Director of Home Safe Shelter, Mariah Lawson. Each participant carried a folder containing reports, medical records, and risk assessments. "Thank you all for coming," I said, clearing my throat as I settled into the head of the table. "Our goal is to develop a unified plan that addresses not only prosecution, but also prevention, support, and long-term safety. These incidents share common roots: economic strain, lack of conflict resolution skills, and isolation. We have an opportunity to pilot a holistic intervention that could serve as a model statewide." Detective Ramirez leaned forward. "We've identified the 3 locations: a rented duplex on East Millbrook, an apartment on Oberlin Road, and a townhouse near New Bern Avenue. In each case, the responding officers completed standard domestic disturbance protocols, separated the parties, and referred them to family services. None of the victims wanted full charges, but the department flagged them as high-risk calls if repeated." Nina Patel added, "Our assessments show elevated stress due to job loss, childcare expenses, and in 2 cases, language barriers. We've assigned each family to a caseworker, but our caseload is overwhelming. If we can integrate legal guidance, counselling, and financial coaching, we may prevent escalation." Mariah Lawson spoke next. "Home Safe Shelter can offer emergency accommodation, support groups, and safety planning workshops. We also partner with microloan programs that help survivors establish financial independence, but we need consistent referrals and follow-up." I unrolled a large sheet of paper on the table and wrote the word integration across the top. Beneath it, I sketched a flowchart: initial reporting, risk assessment, coordinated referral to legal counsel, social services, and shelter resources, mediation sessions where appropriate, ongoing monitoring by a designated prosecutor social. Worker pair. Our office will assign a dedicated assistant DA to each case, I explained. That prosecutor will collaborate directly with a caseworker, ensuring that any decisions about charges, diversion, or protective orders reflect both legal and social considerations. We'll also establish a monthly review meeting to track progress, share data, and adjust protocols. Detective Ramirez nodded. This could revolutionize our response. Instead of fragmented services, families would experience a single, coordinated support network. I scheduled the first pilot for 6 families, 3 existing cases and 3 new referrals. In the weeks that followed, I personally met with each household, listening to their stories in cramped kitchens, on church office couches, and in community centre conference rooms. I witnessed mothers tearful over shattered dishes, men ashamed of lost temper control, and children whose quiet sobbing echoed the adults' distress. Each time I reminded myself that behind every file number lay a human life deserving dignity and care. The pilot's first review meeting, held under a brisk November sky, yielded promising results. 2 families completed mediation successfully, with agreements on respectful communication and shared financial planning. 1 individual requested protective order after renewed threats, and all 6 participants reported feeling heard and supported in follow-up surveys. Detective Ramirez reported a decrease in repeat calls, and Home Safe Shelter secured a grant to expand its capacity. As I drafted the final report to present to the DA, I reflected on the transformation I had witnessed. The law, when mobilized with empathy and resources, could become a tool not merely of punishment, but of restoration. In championing this integrated approach, I honored my founding conviction that justice flourishes when it embraces the full humanity of those it serves. Late one winter evening, as the first flurries of snow dusted the streets of Raleigh, I remained at my desk long after the rest of the office had gone home. My computer screen glowed with spreadsheets and red annotations, the details of a sprawling white-collar fraud investigation my unit had been building for months. The target was Mortimer Holdings, a private construction conglomerate notorious for its political donations and influence over municipal contracts. Whispers in the press suggested the company's executives had been skimming millions from public works budgets, hiding the funds through shell corporations and offshore accounts. I rubbed my temples, recalling the first briefing 6 weeks ago. Detective Marcus Lee of the Financial Crimes Task Force had laid out the timeline. Inflated invoices for overturned sidewalks, phantom labour charges on water main repairs, and a complex network of consulting fees paid to entities with no real officers. Yet the evidence trail had appeared deliberately obfuscated. Layers of corporate entities, nominee directors, and cryptic contracts that shielded the real beneficiaries. "Serena," Marcus had said, leaning over my shoulder as I scrolled through a PDF of bank statements, "we've traced 23 transfers to an account in the Isle of Jerboa, but nothing links it directly to Mortimer's C-suite. Until we can establish that link, the DA's office can't file charges." I had nodded, though inside I simmered with frustration. As someone who had grown up amid the luxuries of my parents' estate, I knew all too well how the wealthy manipulated legal loopholes and wielded influence to protect their empires. I felt a hunger for justice that blurred into a personal vendetta. If I could help bring down a corporate giant hiding behind its own money, perhaps I could atone for the tarnished ideals of my own heritage. That night, however, something shifted. I clicked open a folder labelled Internal Memos, Mortimer, then froze. One file bore the innocuous title, Langford and Company Retainer Agreement, 2018. My heart pounded as I opened it. There it was. A memorandum outlining the terms under which Langford and Company, the investment firm founded by my father, Harrison Langford, had provided strategic financial consulting to Mortimer Holdings. The document referenced quarterly payments of $250,000, disguised as board-level advisory fees. My hands trembled. I closed the file and stared at the ceiling, breathing shallowly. This was no coincidence. The very firm that had alienated me because of its relentless pursuit of profit now appeared implicated in the same scheme I was prosecuting. The retainer agreement alone did not prove wrongdoing, but it offered a crucial nexus. If Langford and Company had knowingly structured shell company transfers for Mortimer, both corporations would face criminal liability. I shut down my computer and walked through the silent office toward Chief Deputy Graham's office. The cold corridor lights flickered as I knocked softly. "Come in," she called. Inside, her silver-framed glasses reflected the desk lamp. "You're here late." I slid the retainer agreement across her mahogany desk. "I found this in the Mortimer discovery files. It shows Langford and Company advising Mortimer Holdings on their finances since 2018. She leaned forward, reading the header. Her brow furrowed. "If this is accurate, we have a conflict of interest, and potentially a criminal scheme involving Langford and Company." I closed my eyes briefly. "I know how this looks, but we can't ignore it. Our duty is to pursue justice, even if it means charging a firm with my family ties." Her expression softened, then hardened with resolve. "You're right. We'll need to bring in the Conflict of Interest Review Board and reassign the case to ensure impartiality. I'll inform the DA. In the meantime, gather all related documents and bank transfer records. We must build a watertight chain, tracing funds from Mortimer through Langford and Company to the offshore accounts." As I left her office, the gravity of the task settled over me like a winter cloak. I thought of my father, the man who had drilled financial ratios into my head at age 9, the man whose approval I had once craved, and who had pronounced me "no Langford" when I defied his business ambitions. Now, I faced the possibility of indicting the very company he had built. Over the next fortnight, I worked alongside prosecutors from the Public Integrity Unit, forensic accountants, and special investigators. We subpoenaed Langford and Company's internal emails, board minutes, and client billing records. We traced wire transfers from Mortimer's corporate accounts to Langford counters. We interviewed whistleblowers, Mortimer executives who feared retaliation, and a junior partner at Langford and Company who had noticed discrepancies in advisory fee calculations but had been silenced. Amid the investigative frenzy, I grappled with conflicting emotions. In dreams, I heard my father's voice. "Don't dishonour the family name," he would say, his tone a blend of disappointment and reproach. I awoke with a tightness in my chest, haunted by childhood memories of silent dinners and cold boardroom stares. Yet each morning, I donned my dark robe and returned to the evidence with renewed determination. Justice, true justice, could not allow money and influence to evade accountability. One afternoon, as I assembled the indictment draft, my phone buzzed with a text from my younger brother, Nolan Langford. "Congrats on the big case. Let's talk soon." My chest clenched. Nolan, who had followed our father into the family business, could be collateral damage. I hesitated before replying. "Thanks. We'll talk." I pressed onward, fueled by the faces of the low-income homeowners who'd seen their sidewalks crumble under Mortimer's inflated contracts, by the veterans like Isaiah Reed who'd been denied full support, and by the single mothers whose dignity I didn't fought to restore. This case represented the culmination of my journey from privileged outsider to principled prosecutor, the moment when I had to hold the powerful to the same standards as the powerless. That evening, I presented the finalised indictment memorandum to Chief Deputy Graham and the DA. The room was tense as I laid out our findings: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and falsification of business records, implicating both Mortimer Holdings and Langford and Company. I watched their faces, noting the mix of shock and professional resolve. When the DA nodded approval, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The next step would be to unseal the charges, secure arrest warrants for Mortimer's CEO and key executives, and issue a subpoena to Langford Co.'s headquarters. The personal cost would be immense: strained family relationships, public scrutiny, perhaps even accusations of betrayal. But in that moment, I realised that the call I had answered years ago, to be a steward of justice, compelled me forward. As I left the DA's office into the cold night air, snowflakes danced around me, reflecting the streetlights like fleeting thoughts. I wrapped my coat tighter and whispered to the quiet city, "Justice may demand sacrifice, but it is the sacrifice that defines us. And those sacrifices, no matter how painful, are the price of integrity." The morning the indictments were unsealed, I arrived at the DA's office before dawn, bracing myself for the inevitable storm. News vans lined Fayetteville Street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers. Reporters clustered in front of the Art Deco courthouse, clutching coffee cups and smartphones, eager for every angle of the unfolding scandal. I took a deep breath, adjusted my black blazer, and walked past the marble pillars that had witnessed countless high-profile announcements. Inside the press conference room, Chief Deputy Graham stood at the podium, flanked by the DA and our lead investigators. Behind them, a large easel displayed copies of the indictment, bold red letters spelling out conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and falsification of business records. Langford and Company and Mortimer Holdings were named as co-defendants alongside 3 CEOs and 2 senior partners. I watched from the back row as Graham delivered the opening statement. She explained how millions had been siphoned from municipal projects, how vulnerable communities had paid the price for inflated contracts, and how our office would pursue every asset tied to the scheme. My heart thudded as reporters scribbled notes and raised their hands. When the DA invited questions, one journalist turned to me. "Ms. Langford, are you related to the Langford and Company named here? How do you respond to accusations that this prosecution represents a personal vendetta?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of my surname. The room fell silent. Clearing my throat, I stepped forward and said, "Yes. I am the daughter of Harrison Langford, founder of Langford and Company. I recused myself from any decision-making once a potential conflict emerged. This case was investigated and approved by our Public Integrity Unit, independent of my family ties. My only allegiance is to uphold the law impartially." Flashbulbs popped. I returned to my seat, cheeks warm with adrenaline. Outside, the headlines exploded. Prosecutor takes on her own family firm. Langford dynasty in disgrace. Veteran DA's daughter at the centre of white-collar probe. I read them on my phone during the mid-morning break, each headline a physical blow. Comments streamed across social media. Some praised my integrity, others accused me of publicity-seeking or ingratitude. I felt both vindicated and exposed, like a chess piece sacrificed for the greater good. Back in my office, I noticed a folder slipped under my door. Inside lay a handwritten note on Langford and Company letterhead. "Gavin, I don't know what drove you to this, but remember the Langford commitment to excellence. Be careful whom you trust. So, Dad." My throat tightened. I crumpled the note in my fist, torn between heartbreak and resolve. I understood then that the greatest trial lay ahead, not only in court, but within the fragile bonds of family. That afternoon, I conferred with our special prosecutor, Elena Vargas, to discuss strategy for the upcoming arraignments. We planned to wield the shell company documents, email chains, and wire transfer ledgers in a meticulously choreographed unveiling. Meanwhile, defense attorneys prepared motions to dismiss based on alleged procedural errors and conflicts of interest. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a message from Nolan. "I'm flying back tonight. Let's talk." I hesitated, then tapped a reply. "Tomorrow, 900 in conference room B." It was the best I could offer under the press glare. That evening, I went home to my small loft in Raleigh's warehouse district. The apartment felt unusually quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. I threw on a pot of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. I thought of the low-income families whose sidewalks languished in disrepair, of veterans denied services, of single mothers who fought to feed their children. The faces that had guided me here, none of them would read the tabloids. Their lives depended on real accountability, not gossip. I resolved to press on. If justice demanded breaking the ties that bound me to my lineage, then so be it. Integrity, I reminded myself, was a hard-earned currency, one worth paying for even when the cost was personal. The following morning, I entered conference room B to find Nolan waiting, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Behind him trailed our mother, Evangeline, pale in a tailored coat. Their presence made my chest ache with a mixture of anger and longing. Nolan spoke first, voice low. "Serena, you've put us all through hell. Dad's furious. He's hiring the best defense team in the state. You knew what this would do." I held his gaze. I didn't choose this lightly. I recused myself. This case isn't about vendettas. It's about stopping a criminal enterprise that hurt real people. Mother stepped forward, eyes glistening. "You're turning your back on your family to chase a headline. Is that justice?" I inhaled slowly. Justice isn't loyalty to a name or a fortune. Justice is the truth. And today, the truth demanded accountability, even if it meant indicting Langford and Company. Silence stretched between us. Nolan's shoulders slumped, and Mother's expression softened into something like resignation. In that moment, I felt the chasm between my past and my present. Painful, irrevocable, but also, I realized, necessary. I had chosen this path. I would walk it to the end, guided by the belief that no one, no matter the pedigree, was above the law. The morning after our fraught family meeting, I arrived at the courthouse with a resolve sharper than any blade. The grand oak doors swung open to admit a torrent of reporters and legal aides, their footsteps echoing across the marble foyer. Today was the arraignment for the Mortimer executives, and, for the first time, my own former colleagues at Langford and Company would stand before the same bench I had once entered as an intern. My team and I gathered in the prosecutor's preparation room, sorting exhibits and rehearsing opening statements. Special Prosecutor Elena Vargas placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "This morning, you'll see their faces in the dock. Remember, facts over feelings. We seek justice, not vengeance." Her calm confidence steadied the butterflies in my stomach. At precisely 9 o'clock, we entered courtroom 5B. The gallery was packed. Journalists craned their necks from the back, and on the front row sat 2 empty chairs reserved for the principals. Executives who had yet to be escorted in. I noted the rumble of anxiety in the air as defense attorneys whispered in low tones, shuffling oversized binders. Judge Raymond Whitman, a meticulous jurist known for his even-handed rulings, presided from the bench. His gavel pounded once to call the court to order. "State and defense, please approach for the arraignment." As we stood before him, the clerk read the charges. 18 counts of wire fraud, 7 counts of money laundering, and multiple counts of falsifying corporate records. Each charge accompanied by specific dates, invoice numbers, and transfer amounts. When the clerk finished, the judge turned to the defense counsel for Mortimer Holdings, then to the attorney representing Langford and Company. At that moment, the 2 executives entered. Margaret Langford, my aunt and Langford Co.'s managing partner, her face a mask of poised indignation, and Thomas Granger, Mortimer's chief financial officer, whose once confident stride now seemed measured and uncertain. I felt a twinge of sympathy for Margaret, her composed exterior cracked only by the betrayal written in her furrowed brow. But sympathy had no place here. Judge Whitman set conditions. Each defendant was to surrender travel documents, post bond, and comply with electronic monitoring. Bailiffs led them away to secure cells. The gallery buzzed with murmurs as cameras flashed. I settled into my seat as the judge set the pre-trial conference for 4 weeks later and dismissed the court. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor and I debriefed near the steps. They'll file motions to dismiss on jurisdictional grounds, she predicted. Expect a showdown over the conflict of interest findings. I nodded, steeling myself for the legal skirmishes ahead. Over the next 2 weeks, our office prepared for intensive motion hearings. The defence argued that Langford and Company had served only as passive consultants, unaware of any illicit fund transfers. They questioned the admissibility of offshore banking records and challenged the chain of custody. Importantly, they claimed my involvement, however formally recused, tainted the proceeding, seeking to derail the entire case. I spent long nights drafting briefs to counter these arguments, marshalling emails and testimony from whistleblowers to show active participation and willful blindness. I annotated depositions in margins, circling phrases like authorize, advise, and facilitate. Each annotation felt like hammering nails in the coffin of impunity. On the morning of the motion hearing, I stood before Judge Whitman once more. Defence counsel laid out their conflict's pitch, pausing for dramatic effect. When my turn came, I spoke with measured clarity. Your Honour, the Conflict of Interest Review Board thoroughly examined my familial ties and concluded they did not compromise the integrity of this office's investigation. Further, the evidence establishes that Langford and Company actively structured transfers to evade regulatory scrutiny. The judge listened, occasionally glancing at the thick dossier before him. After hearing both sides, he dismissed the conflict of interest motion and upheld the admissibility of the disputed evidence. A subdued victory, but crucial. As we exited the courtroom, Eleanor allowed herself a rare smile. Well argued, she said. Now, the real bench trial begins. In the days that followed, I assembled our bench trial strategy. We would call forensic accountants to explain the shell company networks, subpoena internal emails illustrating intentional concealment, and, most pivotally, present Natalia Ruiz, the junior Langford and Company partner who had risked her career to expose the discrepancies. Her testimony could humanize our narrative, showing corporate greed's human cost, both to taxpayers and to whistleblowers. The eve of the trial, I sat alone at my kitchen table, stacks of notes before me, a mug of cooling coffee at my side. Across the tabletop lay the portrait of my father that once adorned our home. I closed my eyes and imagined his stern voice. Excellence, Serena. But tonight, I heard a different echo. Integrity. When morning came, I arrived at the courthouse with purpose. Whatever the outcome, I carried the conviction that truth must not bow to power. As the jurors were sworn and opening statements delivered, I looked at Margaret Langford's anxious profile across the aisle. We were adversaries today, bound by law and circumstance, but entwined by blood. And so, with the gavel's tap, the trial commenced, an extraordinary reckoning of privilege and principle, of legacy and law. In that solemn chamber, I vowed to honour every pledge I had ever made to justice, to stand firm against every tide of influence, and to let no name, however illustrious, place itself above the reach of the rule of law. The first week of the bench trial unfolded like a tightly choreographed drama. Each morning I arrived at the courtroom before sunrise, my briefcase heavy with documents and my mind brimming with questions to pose. I watched as jurors trickled in, 6 men and 6 women of diverse backgrounds, their faces unreadable behind subdued expressions. They carried polite notebooks and pens, ready to record every word. On day 1, I called forensic accountant Dr. Harper Nguyen as my opening witness. Dr. Nguyen was meticulous and soft-spoken, with thick-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanour that belied the complexity of her testimony. Under direct examination, she projected clear flowcharts onto a courtroom monitor, tracing the movement of funds from Mortimer's municipal accounts through a series of shell corporations, then into Langford Co.'s subsidiary accounts, and finally, onward to an offshore holding in the Isle of Jerboa. The jury leaned forward as she described inflated invoices marked up by 20 to 30% and consulting fees that lacked any substantive deliverables. On cross-examination, the defence tried to undermine her expertise, questioning her methodology and the source of her data. They asked if she had ever worked for Langford and Company in the past. She answered truthfully, "I consulted for them briefly in 2015 on an unrelated matter, but all records in that engagement were fully disclosed in discovery." With each pointed question, I watched her composure hold firm. When defence counsel attempted to diminish her findings as industry-standard accounting practices, she calmly retorted that while guardrails existed for consulting fees, the patterns here fell far outside any reasonable benchmark. That afternoon, I introduced the key documentary evidence, a trove of internal emails between Mortimer executives and Langford partners. I passed physical binders to jurors and focused on an October 2018 exchange in which Margaret Langford herself instructed a subordinate to adjust the invoice structure to mask the true beneficiary. The courtroom murmured as the jurors absorbed the gravity of direct involvement. The defence objected, claiming the emails were hearsay and improperly authenticated. Judge Whitman overruled, citing our clear chain of custody and the testimony of the compliance officer who had retrieved them from the company's server under subpoena. The moment felt pivotal, an explicit link between Langford and Company's leadership and the fraudulent scheme. On day 2, I called Natalia Ruiz to the stand. Natalia was young, only 30, and visibly nervous as she entered in business attire, clutching a small notepad. She had been a junior partner at Langford and Company when she discovered discrepancies in the billing statements. Under oath, she recounted how she had approached senior management with concerns, only to be told that these are strategic client arrangements and best not questioned. Her voice trembled when she described handing over the evidence to the DA's office, knowing the personal and professional risks. I paused to let her words settle. I knew then that justice mattered more than my career. A hush fell over the courtroom as jurors exchanged glances. On cross, defence counsel probed her motivations, suggesting jealousy or personal grievance, but Natalia maintained consistency, describing sleepless nights and anxiety over potential retaliation. Her bravery humanized the abstract ledger entries, turning figures on a screen into real acts of conscience. By midweek, our narrative had taken shape. A deliberate, sustained conspiracy orchestrated at the highest levels of 2 powerful firms. The defence countered with character witnesses, long-time clients praising Langford and Company's integrity, and Mortimer managers emphasising their philanthropic projects. Yet, each witness faltered when faced with the documentary trail they could not explain away. On day 4, I rested the prosecution's case and watched defense counsel begin their presentation. They called one executive after another, Mortimer's CEO, Michael Trent, and Langford, and company's lead consultant, Gregory Sinclair, each asserting ignorance of wrongdoing and blaming rogue subordinates. They attempted to shift blame away from the RC boardroom, framing the scheme as a series of isolated mistakes. I sat calmly, jotting notes and preparing my final rebuttal. When Judge Whitman recessed for the weekend, I felt a surge of anticipation. Closing arguments loomed on Monday. That evening, I returned to my apartment and reviewed my outline. I knew the jury needed a cohesive story, one that wove together the cold precision of the forensic analysis, the authenticity of the emails, and the moral clarity of Natalia's testimony. As snow began falling once more, I drafted my closing remarks by lamplight, determined to leave the jurors with one final undeniable truth. This case is more than numbers on a ledger or names on an indictment. It is a testament to the principle that no amount of wealth or influence can place anyone above accountability. Today, you hold in your hands the power to affirm that principle. With those words in mind, I closed my notebook and allowed myself a moment of quiet resolve. The trial's climax approached, and with it, the chance to vindicate the very idea of justice I had devoted my life to defend. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, the winter chill seeping through the courthouse's drafty corridors. I entered courtroom 5B at 8:30, allowing myself time to review my notes and steady my nerves before delivering closing arguments. The jurors filed in shortly before 9, their faces composed but intent. 12 citizens entrusted with deciding whether privilege would shield the powerful. Judge Whitman called the court to order, then turned to me. "Ms. Langford, you may proceed with closing." I rose, smoothing my jacket, and approached the lectern. I began by recapping the essential facts. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past week, you have heard meticulous testimony from Dr. Harper Nguyen, demonstrating how millions of taxpayer dollars were siphoned through shell entities. You examined internal communications in which Ms. Margaret Langford and Mr. Granger explicitly directed these concealment tactics. You listened to Ms. Ruiz, whose courage confirmed that these were not innocent errors, but calculated decisions. I paused, allowing the weight of those revelations to settle. Then I shifted to principle. This trial asks a fundamental question. Does wealth confer immunity? The rule of law demands accountability regardless of a surname or a corporation's political sway. If we permit influence to dictate outcomes, we betray the very fabric of our justice system. Turning to the defense table, I added, the defendant's counsel has suggested ignorance and isolated missteps, but the evidence shows coordination at the highest level, a pattern of deception spanning years, affecting the lives of hundreds of homeowners, veterans, and taxpayers who expected honest public works. I concluded by appealing to their civic duty. Your verdict will send a message that integrity matters, that no ledger entry can outweigh our shared obligation to truth. You hold not only the fate of these defendants, but the promise of equal justice under the law. After thanking the court, I returned to my seat. The defense offered their closing, imploring sympathy for complex business decisions. Then, Judge Whitman gave his instructions, reminding jurors to base their decision solely on evidence presented and the law as charged. As the jury left to deliberate, I exhaled. Months of work culminated in this moment of uncertainty. Hours later, the jurors re-entered. their foreperson stood and announced the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendants, Langford and Company, and Mortimer Holdings, guilty on all counts as charged. A hush fell, broken by the rustle of papers. Relief and vindication washed over me. I closed my eyes briefly, thinking of every person who had placed their trust in this process. In that instant, I knew that justice had prevailed not because of power, but because of perseverance, principle, and the unwavering belief that no one stands above the law. The morning after the verdict, Raleigh awoke under a pale winter sun, and I entered the DA's office feeling the unusual weight of stillness. The triumph of conviction was tempered by the realities yet to come. Sentencing hearings, restitution calculations, and the inevitable appeals process. I passed the press conference podium, recalling the flashbulbs and pointed questions, and made my way to Chief Deputy Graham's office. She looked up from her notes and offered a small, knowing smile. "Congratulations," she said simply. "Now, we must follow through." Our first order of business was the sentencing phase. State guidelines called for significant prison terms, 5 to 7 years per count for wire fraud, up to 20 years for money laundering. But we faced competing considerations: the defendant's lack of prior criminal records, the economic impact of incarceration on employees, and the public's interest in meaningful restitution rather than purely punitive measures. Over the next week, I worked closely with the Victim Services Unit to quantify damages. Homeowners whose sidewalks had crumbled, veterans denied timely repairs to their facilities, and small business owners who lost contracts during the scheme came forward with affidavits describing financial ruin and emotional distress. We catalogued their losses: $220,000 for street repair overruns, $85,000 for delayed housing grants, and countless hours of lost productivity. On the morning of the joint sentencing hearing, the courtroom once again filled with affected citizens, reporters, and the defendants' families. I rose to deliver the state's impact statement. Your Honour, the evidence has demonstrated that the defendants' actions corroded public trust and inflicted real harm on ordinary people. These are not abstract figures. This is a teacher unable to repair her driveway, a veterans centre forced to delay accessibility upgrades, a small contractor driven to bankruptcy. We ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects both the severity of the crimes and the necessity of restoring faith in the rule of law. When Margaret Langford spoke in mitigation, she described her lifelong dedication to philanthropy and her regret at being unaware of the misconduct. Mr. Granger cited personal stresses and asserted a desire to make amends. The judge listened attentively to each plea. Judge Whitman then sentenced both corporations to pay $350,000 each in fines, to establish a joint restitution fund of $500,000 payable directly to the affected parties, and to undergo court-supervised compliance audits for the next 5 years. Individually, Margaret Langford received a prison term of 3 years with eligibility for early release on parole after 18 months, and Granger was sentenced to 2 years, likewise eligible for parole. Both were ordered to perform community service and to donate personal funds to non-profit legal aid organisations aiding low-income residents. As the gavel fell, I felt a profound sense of closure, not triumph, but resolution. The sentence balanced accountability with an eye toward rehabilitation and restitution, reflecting the restorative principles I had championed since my earliest cases. In the days that followed, I oversaw the distribution of restitution funds. I met with homeowners who repaired their sidewalks, with veterans who completed accessibility projects, and with contractors who reopened shops shuttered by debt. Their gratitude was quiet but palpable. Firm handshakes, tears of relief, invitations to speak at community forums. Each encounter reaffirmed why I had chosen this path. Back in my apartment, I reflected on the arc of my journey. From a childhood defined by gilded expectations and emotional distance, I had emerged into a world where justice demanded both rigor and compassion. I had faced down my own lineage to uphold the law, and in doing so had discovered that integrity could transcend even the deepest of family ties. That evening, as the winter twilight settled over Raleigh, my phone buzzed with a message from Nolan. "Thank you for doing what was right. I'm proud of you." My chest tightened with emotion. I drafted a reply. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but I'm glad it mattered." I set the phone aside and looked out at the city lights shimmering across the river. The trial was over, but the work of justice would continue. In every case I prosecuted, every restitution check issued, every person who walked a bit taller, knowing the law, could serve them. And in that ongoing work, I found not only professional purpose, but personal peace. A legacy of conscience far richer than any fortune. In the weeks following sentencing, the defense teams filed their notices of appeal, setting in motion a new phase of the legal process. While the appeals would unfold beneath the insulated protocols of appellate courts, I found myself drawn back into everyday prosecutorial duties, drafting charging decisions, supervising junior attorneys, and overseeing our office's growing roster of diversion programs. The rhythm of new cases offered a welcome refuge from the lingering tensions of the Langford-Mortimer trial, even as its outcome continued to ripple through the community. One morning in early spring, I convened a meeting of the DA's White Collar Advisory Committee. Seated around a polished conference table were experienced prosecutors, investigators from the Financial Crimes Task Force, and representatives from the Compliance and Ethics Division. I opened the meeting by sharing preliminary feedback on the restitution fund distribution. 85% of affected homeowners had received settlements for sidewalk repairs. 60% of Veterans Centre grants had been successfully executed. Nearly all small contractors impacted by the scheme had regained solvency through supplemental microgrants. The room nodded in approval. "This model," I said, "demonstrates how white-collar enforcement can produce tangible community benefits, rather than simply sidelining perpetrators." I proposed drafting a formal policy paper to present at the upcoming National Association of Prosecutors White Collar Conference, a chance to share our integrated approach to sentencing, restitution, and compliance monitoring. As the committee discussion wound down, Chief Deputy Graham entered with a summons. The courtroom awaited me for a hearing on a high-profile police use of force case, unfolding parallel to our financial crimes docket. The abrupt shift from corporate executives to criminal defendants reminded me of the wide spectrum of justice and the constant balancing act required of our office. Later that day, I stepped before Judge Whitman once more, this time representing the state in a case involving an off-duty officer charged with excessive force. The victim, a young black man, bore injuries that demanded accountability. Though the circumstances differed starkly from shell company fraud, the underlying principle remained the same. Whether confronting a powerful corporation or a trusted public servant, justice must apply equally and impartially. In the weeks that followed, I rotated between case conferences appellate brief review sessions, and community outreach events. On one afternoon, I visited a veterans support group where members shared how the restitution funds had enabled crucial repairs to their centre's accessibility ramps. Their gratitude was palpable and humbling. Back at my desk, I opened an email from Nolan. He had accepted a new role as an advisor on the Family Foundation's board, aiming to steer it toward greater transparency and grant-making for underserved communities. His message ended, "I realize now what you always knew. Influence is best used in service of others." I drafted a heartfelt reply, expressing pride in his decision and gratitude for our newfound alignment. That evening, as the sun dipped below the pines of Raleigh, I reflected on how the past year had reshaped my life. From my childhood mansion to crowded courtrooms, from corporate intrigue to the front line of public service, I had learned that justice was not a single verdict, but an ongoing commitment to accountability, repair, and the belief that every decision ripples across lives. With spring's first blossoms unfurling outside my window, I resolved to carry forward the lessons of the Langford Mortimer prosecution, to prosecute with both rigour and compassion, to forge restorative pathways wherever possible, and to ensure that the scales of justice remained ever balanced between law and humanity. Spring had settled fully over Raleigh, painting the courthouse gardens in pastel blooms and casting golden light through the tall windows of my office. I arrived early one humid morning to find a letter from the 4th District Court of Appeal sitting on my desk. The pace of appellate review was deliberate, measured, precise. But today's notice bore good news. Our convictions against Langford and Company and Mortimer Holdings had been affirmed. The panel's unanimous opinion praised the thoroughness of the trial record and the reasoned application of law to the complex financial evidence. I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction before turning to the next pressing matter, supervising the intake of new cases and mentoring the newest group of assistant prosecutors. Among them was Julian Carter, a bright graduate fresh from law school, who reminded me of my own wide-eyed fervour years ago. I invited Julian to join me on a field visit that afternoon to the Community Restitution Centre, a non-profit where part of the Langford Mortimer Restitution Fund had been earmarked for job training workshops. By midday, Julian and I were seated at folding chairs in a sunny multi-purpose room, the hum of sewing machines and the whir of computer monitors creating a lively backdrop. We listened to Programme Director LaToya Mitchell describe how grants had funded technical certifications for participants, plumbing, electrical, and coding workshops that lifted families out of financial instability. I watched Julian's eyes light up as he scribbled notes on his legal pad, clearly recognising the transformative impact of our work beyond the courtroom. After the tour, we walked back through the historic district toward my car. Julian asked me, "How do you balance the emotional weight of these cases with the necessity of keeping an objective legal mind?" I paused beneath an oak in full leaf and replied, "Objectivity is vital, but so is empathy. Every case file represents a person's life. We carry both the facts and the human story. If we lose sight of either, justice suffers." That evening, I returned home to find a voicemail from Nolan. He invited me to a small gathering organised by the Langford Family Foundation, an event to announce revamped grant guidelines promoting social justice initiatives. The same family name that once symbolised disconnected privilege was now being used to channel resources into the community. I hesitated briefly, recalling the fractures of our past year, then dialed back. "I'll be there." At the Foundation's Spring Gala, held in a restored warehouse repurposed as a community arts centre, I mingled with activists, grant recipients, and family members who had supported Nolan's reform efforts. As I listened to a young artist speak about funding for public murals celebrating civic heroes, I felt a quiet sense of closure and renewal. The Langford legacy, once defined by wealth and power, was being reimagined as a force for justice and empowerment. On the drive home through streets still dappled in starlight, I reflected on the arc of my journey. From a courtroom warrior prosecuting high-stakes fraud, to a mentor guiding new attorneys, to a sister witnessing my family's transformation. Justice, I realized, is not a single verdict or a solitary trial. It is a living continuum of accountability, compassion, and collective action. And as I stepped into my apartment, I carried with me the certainty that my work and my family's would continue to shape a more equitable future for the city I served. By early summer, the momentum of the Langford-Mortimer case had become part of routine reference material for incoming prosecutors and compliance officers across North Carolina. Yet for me, each new sunrise still carried the same sense of purpose I felt in my first days at Justice and Hope. On a humid Tuesday morning, I arrived at the DA's office to a flyer posted on the community board. Pro bono family law clinic, volunteers needed. My pulse quickened. Family law was not my primary beat, but I remembered the power of access to counsel firsthand and wanted to contribute. That afternoon, I sat beside public defenders and volunteer attorneys in the basement conference room of the Wake County Courthouse. A steady line of parents and guardians, flanked by social workers, came forward with custody disputes, child support modifications, and protective order petitions. One case caught my attention. Mrs. Amina Jackson, a single mother of two, was seeking to relocate out of state to join a stable job opportunity, but her ex-husband opposed the move. Her eyes brimmed with anxiety as she explained that without relocation, she would lose the position that could lift her family out of precarious housing. Drawing on my courtroom experience, I helped craft a proposed agreement that balanced both parents' rights. Mrs. Jackson would report on her children's academic progress, facilitate reasonable visitation schedules, and designate neutral third-party locations for exchanges. In return, her ex-husband would retain supervised weekend visits and joint decision-making on medical and educational matters. Seeing relief flood Mrs. Jackson's face as she clasped my hand reminded me how meaningful even small legal victories could be. 2 days later, I received confirmation from Chief Deputy Graham. The motion for the Jackson family was granted. I filed a brief impact statement celebrating the outcome and forwarded it to our office newsletter, encouraging others to volunteer. On Friday evening, I walked home under a sky streaked with pink and lavender, the air fragrant with magnolia blooms. My phone buzzed with a text from Nolan. "Dinner on Sunday?" My treat. I smiled, typing back, "Looking forward to it." Despite the past year's fractures, our relationship had begun to heal. That weekend, at our old family home now converted into a community arts centre, Nolan and I sat at the garden bistro table. Over iced tea, we spoke of his work on the Foundation's new accountability measures, and my plans to propose a county-wide restorative justice pilot for juvenile offenders. We laughed at shared memories, holidays in that very garden, and acknowledged the unexpected path we each had taken. As dusk settled, I realized how far I had journeyed, from the confines of privilege into the heart of public service, from prosecuting large-scale fraud to mediating individual needs, from alienation to a renewed family bond. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Whatever comes next," I said, "I'm grateful we can face it together." And so, with summer unfolding around us, I prepared to step into part 15 of my life, embracing every challenge and every human story with the same conviction that true justice demands both courage and compassion. As midsummer's heat settled over Raleigh, I found myself standing once again before the grand oak doors of the courthouse. This time, not as a prosecutor on a headline-grabbing case, but as a mentor, an advocate, and above all, a citizen committed to justice in every form. The Langford Mortimer trial, with its tangled webs of corporate deceit and family conflict, had receded into precedent, its lessons now woven into the fabric of our office's policies and community programs. Yet for me, the journey had been far more than a single prosecution. It had become the story of my life's purpose. That morning, the DA's office hosted a symposium on restorative justice, inviting judges, defense attorneys, social workers, and victims' advocates to discuss new pathways for healing harm. I opened the symposium with a brief reflection. Justice is more than retribution. It is the restoration of trust, of dignity, and of community bonds. Whether we confront broad schemes of white-collar crime or intimate disputes in family law, our goal remains the same: to repair the harm done and to reaffirm the shared values that bind us together. The room resonated with nods and hushed agreement. Over the next 3 hours, panels debated trauma-informed prosecution, survivor-centered advocacy, and community-based diversion programs. I moderated a session on bridging the divide, collaboration between prosecution and social services, sharing the successes and challenges from our domestic violence intervention pilot. When a young public defender asked how I managed to maintain both empathy and rigor, I answered frankly, "I carry every story with me. I allow myself to feel the weight of each person's experience, but I never lose sight of the law's purpose: to balance individual compassion with collective accountability." That afternoon, the symposium concluded with a ceremony honouring Mr. Isaiah Reed, the veteran whose case had first taught me the power of restorative justice. He stood at the podium, award in hand, his voice steady as he spoke of second chances, and the dignity regained when systems choose healing over punishment. The audience rose in applause, and I felt a surge of pride, not in my role, but in the transformation possible when justice listens. Later, I walked to the Community Restitution Centre, now bustling with summer workshops funded by the Langford Mortimer Restitution Endowment. Children practiced coding on donated laptops, while parents learned basic accounting skills. I greeted familiar faces: Julian Carter, now a fully credentialed assistant prosecutor, teaching a session on financial literacy; Mrs. Jackson, the single mother I had helped, now leading a peer support group for co-parenting challenges. Their smiles and nods were proof that the work we had begun months ago continued to bear fruit. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, I returned home to find Nolan waiting on my porch with 2 glasses of iced lemonade. He had invited our parents as well, hoping to bring the family full circle. I stepped onto the porch and saw my mother, Evangeline, her posture still elegant but her eyes softened by time, and my father, Harrison, standing tall yet marked by the humility of the past year's revelations. We sat in folding chairs beneath hanging lanterns strung across the yard that once loomed so cavernous. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Cicadas hummed in the heat, and the fireflies began their evening dance. Then Nolan raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, voice warm. Father cleared his throat and met my gaze, the once formidable titan of finance seeming smaller in the gathering dusk. "Serena," he began, "you have shown courage and integrity beyond what we could have imagined. You held me and my firm to account. I was wrong to value profit over principle. I hope, in time, you can forgive my blindness." Tears filled my mother's eyes as she reached for my hand. "I always admired your strength. I feared it would pull you away, but now I see it brought you home. I felt something I had not known in years. Complete belonging." "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching. "I carry our family name with a new understanding. That true legacy lies not in wealth, but in the justice we leave behind." We sat together as night fell, the air sweet with magnolia and possibility. The courthouse and the courts remained at the heart of my life, but in this moment, the boundary between my personal and professional worlds dissolved. We were not merely a prosecutor and her family. We were people committed to growth, accountability, and compassion. In the months to come, I would continue drafting indictments, negotiating restorative agreements, and mentoring those who followed. The challenges of inequality, of systemic failures, and of human frailty would persist, demanding both resolve and empathy. But I knew I would face them with the conviction forged through every case, every family dispute, every restorative circle. As I blew out the lantern candles that night, I carried forward a lesson etched into every part of my journey: that justice is not a destination, but a horizon we constantly pursue, guided by conscience, sustained by compassion, and illuminated by the unwavering belief that every person, regardless of background or privilege, deserves to be seen, heard, and held accountable with both firmness and grace. And in that pursuit, I found not only my career, but my truest self.